Well, I'm actually just going to start by letting the folks on the panel introduce themselves. So Desmond, let's start with you.
My name is Desmond Kirton Jr. Current student at Cabrini University, finance major.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lewis Lin, currently a rising senior at the University of Pennsylvania, study public health and education policy, and I'm a first-generation low-income student. That's what most of my work on campus has been around.
Hi, I'm Eileen Divringi, and if you're thinking I look a little too old to be in college, you are correct. I am a Community Development Research Associate here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia.
Great. Well, we're going to open the panel and hear a little bit about the research that Eileen has conducted, and then I'd like to hear from our students about how that research maybe comports with their experiences, their peers' experiences, what's different, what's the same, and then we can kind of have Eileen jump in along the way and talk about how those then mesh with other research as well. So, Eileen.
All right, so as a primer for our discussion today, I'm going to talk about some research that's been referenced earlier today that I conducted along with my colleagues Keith Wardrop and Kyle DeMaria here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And we've been looking at the Bridging the Gap program at Rutgers Camden, which Chancellor Haddon spoke to at the beginning of our session today. And essentially, we approached Rutgers Camden when we first heard that they were announcing the program to say that we wanted to conduct an evaluation. It was right in our backyard. It's in our district. It's an institution that already serves so many students who are underrepresented in college. And so we wanted to learn more about the model and see sort of what lessons can be learned both for the program but for other institutions that are interested in implementing something similar. So part of the reason we felt, just backtracking a little bit, so most of what I'm going to talk about today are interviews that we conducted as part of this evaluation. And part of why we thought it was important to include these interviews is the same reason that we wanted to include this panel in our event today. And that's because it's really essential to get insights on students' experiences, both with College Promise programs specifically, but also their financial lives in general as students, to understand how to design programs that are responsive to those needs. Because we know from the research that the design of these programs really matters for how effective they are. And so knowing kind of students' experiences with these programs is kind of critical to ensuring that you're designing a program that will work for the people it's supposed to work for. So before I get into it, I'm required to give you this disclaimer. The views in this presentation are mine and those of my co-authors. They are not the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. So I'll start with just a little brief recap of the kind of parameters of the program. So Chancellor Haddon gave you an outline of the program, but just to sort of recap for the purposes of going through our findings. So it is a last dollar financial aid program. So it's coming in after students have their Pell, after they have their state aid, after they have their need-based institutional aid. And it's in order to be eligible for the program, students have to be New Jersey residents. They had to be first-time college students, at least in the first kind of iteration of this program. And also sort of specific to the first iteration of this program, they had to fall into one of these two groups. So I believe in the handout you have in your packets, there's 3 groups now, but when we first initiated the evaluation, there were 2 income groups. So for students coming from households that make $60,000 or less per year, it's essentially kind of what you think of as a free college program. Any remaining tuition after those need-based financial aid sources are applied is waived. And then for students in that $60,000 to $100,000 income range, the half of their unmet tuition costs are waived. So students are automatically put in the program. They just have to complete their FAFSA. There's no additional, you need to fill out an application, you check a box, none of that. And in order to remain eligible for the program throughout their academic careers, they have to maintain good academic standing, which essentially just means, for most programs, a 2.0. But they also have to complete 30 credits per academic year. And this speaks to what Chancellor Haddon was saying about using this program as a way to encourage on-time graduation. With the idea being that 30 credits a year is essentially the typical amount a student would need to take to complete their program in 4 years. So 2016 was the inaugural cohort for this. We plan on following these students for 5 years. So we are currently, I think, going into their junior years. And it's worth noting, and this was referenced in the earlier panel, that there are a number of students at Rutgers Camden who fall into this, typically the less than $60,000 income range, who are not technically in this program because their combinations of need-based aid are sufficient to cover sort of all of their tuition and campus fee costs. So just briefly on our research plan. So we've been very lucky to work with an institution that really genuinely wants to understand how their program is working, really genuinely wants to use the feedback we give them to make improvements. And I feel very fortunate as a researcher in that regard. And we knew from the outset that we wanted to do a mixed methods research program. So our plan is, as I mentioned, to follow the students through the first 5 years. So far, we've published 2 reports, both of which are available on the publications table back there. And I'm going to very briefly, in a way that I hope will not be duplicative of what we've heard so far, talk about our primary quantitative findings, and then I'll dive into the specifics from the student interviews, highlighting kind of direct quotes from students that we spoke to. So first, and this is something that was very nicely teed up by the first panel, but one of the clearest quantitative outcomes we saw was that the program appears to have boosted enrollment, particularly among students who are in that kind of free college bin, income bin, but also among African American and Latino students as well. And we took this as an indication that sort of in the same vein as prior research, that students are really sensitive to kind of the perceived cost of going to college. And then since we've only looked at programs or outcomes rather for students in the first year after their first year of the program, we don't have a completion indicator or anything like that. But for the sake of brevity, I'm going to highlight a composite indicator where we look at whether students were able to meet both of those academic requirements, so maintain at least a 2.0 GPA and complete 30 credits in a year, and then re-enroll in Rutgers Camden the second year. And so we're comparing students who are in the lower income bin, the middle income bin, and then students who did not have any tuition left over after need-based aid, so not technically bridging the gap participants. We're looking at them compared to similar students from the prior 2 years of school. And so this is an area where the comparison, there are a couple different ways to make these comparisons, right? So I'm very jealous of Alyssa's very clean randomized control trial kind of experiment as a researcher. We're sort of evaluating this as it unfolds. But essentially one way to think about looking at whether or not the programs had an impact is to compare these students to similar students from the prior 2 years. We do that, we see pretty positive outcomes. So pretty strong increases in the percent of students who met both of those requirements and re-enrolled. But what we also see is that for students in this no tuition gap category, so the ones who are not necessarily receiving a benefit from bridging the gap, they also saw those improvements. And so when we kind of looked into this a little bit more, we found that there are other kinds of enhancements going on at Rutgers Camden all the time, so improvements in counseling, in course registration policies, things like that, that may have accounted for some of these effects. And so when we did sort of an analysis comparing the relative improvement for students in that lower income bin versus students who didn't have a tuition gap, we found that those improvements were relatively similar. So kind of headline, students are doing better than similar students in the prior years, but we can't say that this is specifically because of bridging the gap. All right, that's all the numbers I'm going to make you look at so we can get into sort of the more, the focus of this panel, which is hearing sort of students' perspectives. So moving on to our qualitative findings, when students were first adjusting to school, we spoke to them in their first semester, and we asked them to reflect on their college application process. And a number of them, probably unsurprisingly, because we were speaking to students who ended up enrolling at Rutgers Camden, said that the Bridging the Gap program was a major factor for them. So students and their families really responded to this message about college being free or very affordable. And I really enjoyed this quote from a student who was saying that, her grandma heard about it and then wouldn't stop bothering her, which is, it's a testament to how involved a lot of these families are in this decision as well. We heard a lot from students about anxiety around student loan debt, so they're really absorbing this national conversation about that. But also, a lot of them also sort of pointed to particular people they knew in their lives who had struggled with either student loan debt or some other form of debt. And so the second quote here is very kind of illustrative of that perspective. So they don't want to put their family in any more stress and debt. When we spoke to students about sort of the impact that Bridging the Gap has had on their experience in college thus far, a lot of students sort of reported that it's helped them kind of reduce their financial anxiety around college. It's freed up some of the mental bandwidth to dedicate more towards their academics, so more time to study than to think about money. And we heard this a lot from students who actually were in the income categories that make just a little bit too much to qualify for most financial aid programs. So maybe adding just a little bit of complexity to what we've heard so far. Obviously, the greatest need is for the lowest income students, but we spoke to a lot of relatively middle income students who had a lot of financial anxiety around college as well, especially students who are coming from households where maybe there's multiple children who are going to end up in college. So at the same time, unfortunately, some of the financial relief that the program offered was sort of undercut by challenges students had with the financial aid system. So the financial aid process, as we've heard, could be the first time that a lot of these students are really navigating a very bureaucratic process, having to advocate for themselves in that process. And at times students found it confusing, and at times students found it, demoralizing. So it's a highly opaque process. And unfortunately, because of some challenges with how the state was processing financial aid, there was a lot of delays in certain aid disbursements, and particularly for low-income students who are sort of disproportionately picked for additional verification. It could already be a challenge for them to get together the information they need to complete these applications. But when you go through the verification process, you have to produce additional documentation, and that can result in delays. That can result in adjustments to your account. So we would hear from students, I got an email saying I owed $375 randomly. I thought I'd paid everything off, as a result of some of the delays in the processing of the state aid, a lot of students didn't necessarily have their financial aid settled until months into the semester, and some of them even into the following kind of spring semester, which is challenging because, the costs of semester, or the costs of going to college are kind of front-loaded at the beginning of the semester. That's when you're buying a lot of your books, a lot of your materials. So that's a challenge that I think is worth keeping in mind when you're thinking about the last dollar model, because it is contingent on sort of all of these moving pieces around the federal financial aid and the state financial aid. And ultimately, these discrepancies were totally sorted out, but a lot of students sort of reported feeling like a little bit of mistrust towards the process. So like it's guaranteed, but it's not guaranteed at the same time. So beyond tuition, when we spoke with students, we found that most, if not all of the students we spoke to shared some responsibility for costs kind of that are just day-to-day living in non-tuition educational expenses. So a lot of students were commuter students who have to cover the costs of putting gas in their car, insurance, things like that. And a lot of students also contributed to their household's finances, or would be expected to if there was a financial emergency in their home. In order to cover these expenses, students need to have cash on hand. They need to have some sort of financial flexibility. And they described sort of a patchwork of different strategies for this. So a lot of students use savings from working over the summer, scholarships from their high schools, tax refunds, birthday money, everything you can think of, but also, of course, working during school was a very important way for students to have the cash on hand they needed for these kinds of expenses, and also loans as well. As Alyssa referenced in her presentation, these kinds of costs can become real barriers to persistence in college because students see that as part of whether or not they can afford to be in college. So even though they're kind of relatively low cost when we're thinking about things like tens of thousands of dollars for tuition, they're very present on students' minds. So we heard a lot from students about the challenges of balancing their employment and their school lives. A lot of students who we spoke to sort of continued their jobs that they had been in high school, or assumed that they could continue to work at kind of a similar number of hours per week. but quickly found that their work schedules and their academic schedules, especially with a much more demanding kind of college-level academic expectation, that juggling those time commitments was really difficult. And this was particularly true for students who worked off campus. They had supervisors or managers who weren't necessarily accommodating of their school schedules. They couldn't reduce their hours during finals or anything like that. And in the second year of school, we saw a lot of students sort of step back on that. Those who were able to sort of decided to work less, to stop working, or a number of students switched to on-campus jobs that offered a little bit more flexibility. And for a lot of students, this meant they would have to rely more heavily on financial support from their families, or they would have to take out additional loan money in order to cover some of those expenses that they no longer had the wages to support. But unfortunately, there were a lot of students who didn't really feel like they could make those kinds of trade-offs and still sort of get through their days. So this first quote here sort of illustrates that. I know I have a test, but I also know I have to work because if I don't work, I don't have gas money to make it to school, to take the test and graduate, right? So that student is in a bind. And I think one thing that that really came through in a lot of these interviews is that students have very heterogeneous experiences. There are some students who are able to seek additional support from their families and are able to scale back on work hours, and there's some students for whom that's just not a possibility. So for a lot of students, there was a real reluctance to take on more debt. There was a reluctance to go and request more from their families. And even some students who we spoke to who had reduced the amount of time they were spending at work or stopped working entirely suggested that if something changed in their family's financial situation, they might be induced to go back to work. So a lot of students are navigating a very kind of financially precarious circumstance, and so when we see that non-academic factors are a major driver of students not completing their degrees, this kind of speaks to that. All right, so moving on to the program requirements. One thing we found particularly in students' first year is that they weren't actually aware of the program requirements, and to some extent, this is sort of a function of the program just automatically enrolling people, like perhaps if they had applied, they would be aware of it. And I'm not advocating for creating an onerous application process, but it's also very common for students to not necessarily be aware of the academic requirements associated with various sources of aid. So while I'm sure that this was communicated to students many times in many different ways, just it got lost in the shuffle of the transition to college. And so students who got to their second semester and realized that they had not been taking enough credits to complete the 30 credits in like a regular academic year, were in kind of a tough spot. So some of them, if they learned early enough, could load up their schedules and try to make up the difference. Whether or not they're able to do that might depend on, their employment situation. And then others were looking into taking summer classes, and at the time, financial aid was generally not available for the summer term. So they were looking at potentially an out-of-pocket cost that might need to be covered with loans, most likely. But fortunately, Rutgers Camden sort of realized this challenge as they were going into the summer after the first year, and they were able to extend some additional financial aid to students who were at risk of becoming ineligible for the program. And the summer semester sort of in general turned out to be pretty critical for students to be able to get to that 30 credit threshold. So about a quarter of students in the program ended up enrolling in summer courses, and that is a 10 percentage point increase compared to similar students from the prior year. So 10 percentage points, not 10%. So it was a very large increase in the number of students who took summer classes. And sort of subsequent to this, the Department of Education has extended Pell year-round. So this is an option that'll be a little bit more financially sustainable for students in the future. But it's just worth noting that when you set sort of some higher academic expectations, those summer courses can be really critical for making sure people can meet them. All right, so I'm going to wrap up what I think are some of the big takeaways from our research so far. So the first is that students are really responsive to messages around college affordability, right? So when they hear that college is free to them, they will go to there. It was, I think someone in the first panel mentioned, students might not be aware that they can go to college for essentially free just because it's so complicated to figure out exactly how much it's going to cost for you to go to college. that this program, sort of that messaging, really drove that point home for them. Second is that students, especially first-year students, are probably going to need help navigating the financial aid process. But again, a point made in the earlier panel is just navigating sort of the college life in general. And again, for last dollar programs that require coordinating across a bunch of different agencies that are dispersing aid, this is a particular challenge. So in addition to sort of tuition expenses, students need a financial buffer that they can rely on when they have financial emergencies, or even just to cover sort of fully anticipated but still costly things like textbooks and computers and things like that. Due to issues with time constraints and financial constraints, a lot of students are not necessarily able to scale back work hours without taking out additional loans. So there is sort of this trade-off. If you want students to be enrolled in a full course load, they're going to experience sort of a work loan trade-off in order to have the financial resources they need to cover those ongoing expenses. So the summer term, again, really important for enabling students to remain on track for a 4-year graduation timeline. And lastly, understanding and being responsive to student feedback is really important for these programs. So through student feedback, we identified the challenge with students being unaware of the 30 credit requirement, and that enabled sort of the institution to respond in a way that ensured the students would remain eligible. And with that, I'll take it back to the panel.
Great. Thanks so much, Eileen. So one of the big benefits that Eileen just talked about that we heard earlier was around this message of free college. And if a program is designed well and there's not a ton of eligibility requirements, or if the message really gets out there, that that clear message can actually reach folks who might not otherwise understand what aid is out there. So I'm wondering if our students here can talk about what you actually knew about college costs when you were thinking about applying to college, what you knew when you did apply to college, and then what was the reality when you sort of enrolled, got your financial aid packages throughout your experience so far, and how those original perceptions then actually matched with what's happened so far.
So I graduated from Morrell Dobbins CTE High School, and we had College Possible to support us. So as far as knowing college costs, out of the 15 colleges we had set up, the ones that I applied to, the 15, we had set up a graph calculating the cost and everything we had to pay for and everything that was taken care of by financial aid, along with Pell Grants and other grants by College Possible, showing us what we have to pay out of pocket, if any. And so that process is pretty easy. I didn't know exactly how much I would have to pay out of pocket until the first day of school, which is still not a problem. And what was the other question?
Well, how it matched the reality. And actually, if you could give a few sentences on College Possible for folks who might not be familiar with the program, I think that would be great as well.
So how it matched the reality? I mean, I know I had to work regardless going to school. I try to take out as minimum loans as possible. Fortunately enough, Cabrini offered a lot along with the other grants. So in total, I had to pay $3,000 out of pocket, which is not much of a problem. And I would say it's worth it, worth the education I gained so far, at least. And for those of you who do not know what College Possible is a program that helps you get into college for low-income students or any students that is where it's stationed inside of a high school or whatever school is in, and it helps you get through college. So they work with you, more like a resource.
And really quickly, can you talk about, so when you were applying, you said 15 colleges, and they set up a chart for you to figure out what all your options were, and you would sort of compare across, or what did that look like?
Yeah, so I know I wanted to major in finance, and I know I wanted to be in an MBA program. I also knew, like, what I wanted to do. So I went through colleges looking for ones that specialized in what I wanted to do. So College Possible helped me. They put me on websites I never knew existed, scholarship websites I never knew existed, and we went through it like that. And going through the colleges, we marked them down on a graph, how much they cost, what was being taken care of together on a graph out of all the colleges that I got accepted to, which was the 15. And that's how that process went.
I'm originally from New York, so I'll start off with that. And this was before the New York's free college program began. So keeping that in context. So in that mind, going to an institution like Penn was kind of the way, because going to a state school would have cost even more money because the financial aid that they would have given me would have been less than an institution like Penn. So that kind of limited where I was looking. But that is something when you're looking at cost of attendance or not using net price calculators and seeing, or even the flaws of net price calculators, students may not necessarily understand how much money they will actually have to pay depending on the institution that they go to. So some students may cut out all of these institutions like Penn because they see the high $70,000 price rate and then not even try, even though their aid that they would have gotten would have been able to match that. So that was kind of the context of which schools I tried to apply to.
And how did you figure that out?
How did I figure that out? That was from my mom being like, you have to go to one of these schools because they give you a lot of aid. And even then my parents didn't go to college, but she had a little book that she would read, and going through would be like, okay, these are the schools that you can get money from. So money was a huge factor. Now that New York State does have some sort of program that allows for free college, that could have changed the possibilities of different people. But as of now, or as of then, that was the path that I was on. Getting into college, some of the things that may have taken people by surprise, especially me, was that coming from school, place where my insurance was covered by the state, going to Pennsylvania, it no longer applied, and then health insurance is required by the school. How do you make use of these costs and needing to get onto the school's health insurance, but then not knowing that there's a cost associated with that, and then going to the financial aid office and saying, I can't pay this, can you please give me more aid? That kind of conversation. But things like that weren't necessarily communicated within the whole package, but obviously, tuition, room and board, things like that were all talked about and publicized on the website. Things that have changed in terms of expectations since then, with the new tax bill that passed recently, financial aid that isn't covered by tuition, room or board, it gets taxed more. So now my taxes went higher this year because the aid that I was getting from the institution like Penn would not be necessarily untaxed. So things like that aren't necessarily playing out. And then I was selected for verification 2 out of the 3 times thus far, and that delaying the amount of aid that you're going to be getting. So Pell Grants don't necessarily anything at the federal level, so that'd be Pell Grants, things like Perkins student loans and things like that would not be able to be covered until your verification went through. And at least in our school, we had a little backup in that case, so students didn't get a lot of their Pell Grants until second semester, and that doesn't work out because you will not be able to cover some of the things. But our financial aid office is great in terms of upfronting some of that cost and waiting for that to come in, but it does cause some issues in terms of expectations.
And Eileen, do you want to say a little bit more about some of the interviews you ran in terms of anything you heard about expectations on college costs, and then what surprised students when they got there?
So there was a quote that I think I cut at the last minute, but that I really like, where a student was like, I wish textbooks were included in tuition because that's really expensive. So a lot of students, that was probably the biggest thing that we heard coming into their first years, was the expense associated with textbooks. And in the second year, we heard some students sort of taking the risk of just, not necessarily buying the textbook, or trying to feel out if they really needed to, if maybe they could go to the library and get it, or they could borrow it from a friend or something like that. So those kinds of educational costs that are really part of being in college, but aren't necessarily covered by a free college program, were definitely challenging for students in a way they didn't anticipate.
Great. And actually, I think all of you anticipated my second question, which is around non-tuition expenses. So a lot of the conversation and debate around free college programs centers around, well, a lot of these non-tuition costs are actually what cause a lot of the problems, and how are we incorporating those in, which then, of course, relates to the issue of work. And so I'm wondering if, Desmond and Louis, you could talk about your own experience working as a student, how you make decisions about how much you work versus how much you can afford not to work, and how that might impact your studies.
Okay, so my first semester, I got a job like close to the beginning, but kind of close to the middle of the semester. My first one was working at UPS, which was very critical. One of my required classes I was suffering in because UPS has like fixed schedules, but at the time that was the quickest job I could have, but I also needed money to pay bills, and bills include living bills. So I couldn't leave right away, but fortunately enough, I did pass that class with a D. The next semester, I got another job, which made it easier, but the hours I was able to work were chicken change compared to what I needed. So, yeah, now that I'm out, I gotta work hard.
There was definitely a change in terms of the jobs that I took along my path, granted, due to some like academic intellectual pursuits that changed within myself. But one of the biggest changes was that my first year I worked as a research assistant at the Children's Hospital, but that was a job that, required you to be focused every single second of the day and actually doing things. And that kind of took away time that you could be studying, whatnot. So during my second semester or my second year, I then changed to work at the law library, which allowed me to sit at a desk and do my homework while still doing jobs and then getting paid for doing my homework at that time, but things like that. But that kind of the calculations that you need to take to make sure that you're able to balance both, I guess, are adjusted based on how you factor in number of courses you're taking or your academic, non-academic requirements in terms of extracurriculars and things like that.
And I know, Louis, you've worked with a lot of first-generation students, peers on your campus. Do you have other insights from some of your peers in terms of their own work schedules, how much folks are working? And
yeah. So our school limits us to working 20 hours in federal work, in terms of work study jobs. But that being said, there are still students that take non-work study jobs and supplement that 20 hours to make enough money. So things like that may not be anticipated. And in terms of how much you're making, it's given that we're in Pennsylvania, minimum wage is not that high. So then some people may have to go out to get an off-campus job because they might pay more, or the jobs that you look through in work-study funds may not be necessarily what you want to do in the future, but because it pays more than other work-study jobs, you take that job instead. So that's like, there are some jobs that pay a good $13 an hour, which are the jobs that most people flock to first, and then you see what happens after. That's kind of the landscape. There are students that we're in a system where federal financial aid is built into your schedule. So I kind of liked what Chancellor Haddon was talking about in terms of making it a situation where you're not required to work or making that need to be lower because other things are covered. But we are in a system that is built into your financial aid. So in order to get that, you do end up working.
And Eileen, any thoughts from the research you did at Rutgers?
Yeah, so I think a lot of students who switched to on-campus jobs, and we did hear a lot about these tensions. So a lot benefited a lot. I think they were much happier with their on-campus jobs. They had much more flexible employment situations. But yeah, it's definitely a situational thing because a lot of students said they couldn't make as much doing on-campus jobs. So whether or not you can afford to switch to an on-campus job was a factor. And a lot of students are commuters, so a lot of students actually prefer to work closer to their homes. Because that's more convenient for sort of weekend scheduling and things like that. But I do think that there's a lot of opportunity to use those work study funds in ways that, help students who need to work or feel the need to work do so in a way that is still more accommodating of their class schedules.
And actually, we had a question from the audience about work study and whether or not your research had incorporated any specific questions about that. So it seems like a good time to, if there was anything else on federal work study within your research.
I think that largely covered it. I mean, we didn't necessarily look at it in the quantitative analysis that we did, but we asked students about their employment situation each year that we spoke to them. So we spoke to them in the fall of 3 years so far. And yeah, I think that about covers it, is that the work-study jobs offered more flexibility. And, you know, I was thinking when Lewis was saying that everyone wants kind of the more like passive versus active jobs. Like I remember when I was in college, everyone wanted to be the person who like swiped people into the gym. Like that was the best job. But yeah, so some students were able to find positions that worked for them that way.
And Desmond, you had a couple thoughts.
Yeah, I'm sorry. For those of you who may be taking note, I was a commuter at Cabrini, still am a commuter, and I would say it was definitely worth it. Paying rent versus paying $12,000 on campus, that's very much worth it. And the jobs that I had were not minimum wage, so, and I was still having a hard time, you know, living.
We already talked about this a little bit already as well, but Eileen, in your research, you identified some bureaucratic programmatic glitches. It sounds like some of them were from the federal side and some from the state side, and maybe some from the actual program itself. Can you talk through where those glitches occurred? And then I think would love to hear from Lewis and Desmond. We already heard a little bit about verification, but you know, other challenges on the programmatic implementation side around any of the aid programs that you were benefiting from. But
yeah, so there were, I think, a couple different things that were happening when students were trying to figure out what was going on with their financial aid. And so one of them was just as documents are processed by these various entities, the amount that students are deemed to be eligible for can change, right? And so when you talk about a last dollar program, it really depends on being able to calculate what those last dollars are. And in some ways, that's a little bit more of a moving target than you might think. So if your federal aid gets adjusted or your state aid gets adjusted and you know, Rutgers doesn't necessarily compensate for it immediately, or, you know, it doesn't, you know, alert somebody in the system that, hey, this needs to be adjusted. Students would see like, oh, I owe like $400 on my account when they had thought that they wouldn't know anything or that they had already covered whatever they needed to cover. So that was one aspect of it. Another aspect of it was that students, it was not necessarily easy to determine if they qualified for all of the aid that they thought they would qualify for going in. So it took a long time to determine whether students were eligible for state aid. And that's the one that I think took into the spring semester. Is there some students who looked like they weren't eligible for state aid and therefore were not going to receive Bridging the Gap because it is contingent on all of these other sources of aid. And so sorting that out was very difficult for some students. And then I think, you know, just kind of first year implementation stuff. Again, we're looking at the very first cohort that participated in this. There's certain things around like eligibility that, you know, are not going to, you're not going to anticipate that someone particular case is going to have to come up and you, like, in responding to that case, make decisions that affect sort of policy. So around like students who are permanent residents versus students who are citizens and things like that, what aid they're eligible for and how much needs to come in to fill the gap for them. So those were major ones. And I think the risk, because I mean, ultimately all of these students' accounts were settled in some fashion. But I think the risk is that students will approach the financial aid system with a lot more skepticism and not necessarily see it as something that they can rely on through their financial career. So if they are going through, you know, some financial turmoil, they might not think, oh, well, at least, you know, my college is covered. They might not feel like they can rely on that.
I talked about verification of Pell Grants already, so I'll talk about another aspect in terms of how you design programs with outside scholarships that aren't necessarily given through federal grants or through your university and how those get incorporated into the financial aid package. So at least for us, because outside scholarships are not considered part of the whole university grant system, you end up having that count towards the end of after you get all of this aid, and then what happens is that they take away from your student contribution first, which is great. But if you have an outside scholarship that is higher than your student contribution, then it cuts off from the university contribution, and then that replaces it. Granted, this is a pragmatic approach where you can then allocate that aid to another student, but it is something that students may not necessarily take into consideration when they say, I got this much from X university, and I got this much from my outside scholarship, and I will get X amount of money overall in my financial aid, but that doesn't actually play out because you cut off from your university aid with your outside scholarships. But that policy could be different in various institutions, so that's something to keep in mind. And then I guess another thing would be in terms of costs for things that may not necessarily be built into the system of financial aid, so it's not necessarily kind of bureaucratic, but not really bureaucratic, in terms of things like if you're taking art classes and you need, those tend to have higher costs of photography camera or canvas and things like that that aren't built into the system, and how do you work your way around that to make sure you get the necessary aid?
I'm sorry, I need the question again.
Oh, no problem. Any bureaucratic challenges in accessing your aid? And actually, I would open it more broadly to saying accessing, we talked a lot about some of these other programmatic wraparound supports that might be helpful for students that could go along with financial aid. Any barriers to accessing any of the supports on campus, that maybe you should have been eligible for something, but you couldn't access it along the way?
I would say I chose Cabrini University because I didn't have to deal with much of this in the case.
Fair enough.
But I did ask a lot of questions. I was not afraid to go in Cavalry Express or, the area where they have this information available to those who want to acquire it. But as far as getting more money than I could, I have tried at various universities, requesting for more financial aid, of course, because who wants to pay for education? And unfortunately, it was unsuccessful. So yeah, I say that was basically the only barrier as far as questioning and answering. Not much of a problem there.
And you were trying to access more financial aid to pay for some of those non-tuition costs?
Oh, to pay for that tuition cost, because I still had
Tuition
a
cost,
$3,000 balance.
Okay.
And
We had a question here, just going back to some of those non-tuition costs. I see some friends from CLASP in the room who've worked a lot on access to public benefits, so making sure that students can access some of those benefits, like you mentioned health insurance, that you might actually be able to get through Obamacare, for example. Did you get any information about things like publicly available health insurance, for example, or any other benefits that might have helped out along the way in addition to your financial aid?
I think in my case, or most of the things that you learn about are through other students or older students who have gone through the process. And then if you qualify for work study, then you technically also qualify for food stamps. So there's a pathway for a lot of students on campus that actually get food stamps through that. I don't know if it's actually legal for a financial aid office to talk about these things, because I know they also can't help us file FAFSA things or go through things like that because of legal ramifications. So I'm not necessarily sure if that's something that a lot of universities make public, but there are means of learning from other students, but that also requires a lot of institutional knowledge of once one student leaves, who can pass that information on, and issues with that.
Excuse me, I am uneducated in this field, so.
I'm sorry?
I'm not educated in this
Sure,
field.
no worries. Eileen, did you hear anything about that?
We didn't hear anything specific about that, no.
So just bringing this all together, what was the one thing about paying for school or navigating through school that you wish you knew at the start of your college experience that you know now?
I think going into the process, it was a lot of like, this is a future Lewis problem, and that's not necessarily the right mindset to take things. Granted, a lot of what I did throughout, so my cousin goes to Drexel, and she comes from a situation where her financial familial contribution should technically be lower than ours, but because she's not getting as much aid, she has to pay more and take out more loans. So I can talk about it from that standpoint, because I do think Penn has helped me not have to worry too much about it. But just making sure that you're able to, since it is a situation where you have to pay for get more loans and things like that, but we just don't know how the loan process works. We are entering college maybe 18, 17 for some people, and you're just not educated about these things when you're in high school. So a loan comes by and the institution tells you that this is what it is, and you sign off, but like, what is a subsidized loan and what is an unsubsidized loan, and how do you go about that process? And just, I guess, educating myself just so I can help other people in that sense. Like my cousin, who I had to help her go through what loans to take and what isn't necessarily the best loan to take, because you won't get the necessary interest or return that you'll be making.
So College Possible made sure we were educated in that field, as far as paying. Like we went to the furthest extent to see like what we could get for free, what finances would be given to us to, make sure we got in and out of at least our first year, taking baby steps. So I would say something I wish I knew in the beginning of the year, or maybe before I started, is that I didn't have to do essays for scholarships, because essays are definitely a burden on my behalf. Yeah.
You both talked a bit about loans right now. We have a popular question up top, which so I was wondering if students could talk about their preferences for loans or not taking out loans. So as you were embarking on your college process, what was your general feeling about student debt, how much you wanted to avoid it, whether or not you thought you'd have to take it on anyway? Kind of talk about that.
All right, so before I started, I didn't think I would have to take out any loans, and I wasn't planning to. Considering I lived off campus, the cost was a lot less, but I can't imagine how much danger I would be in if I did live on campus. So fortunately enough, it was $3K. So I did take out a subsidized. Fortunately, that is a loan that doesn't accrue interest right away, like I'm unsubsidized. So I have time to pay it as I'm paying it off now. So that makes this process a lot easier. Now I'm just waiting for financial aid for next school year to see what that's like.
And for me, I knew that taking out loans was not something that I wanted to do. And the good thing about Penn is that it's all grant-based money, so I didn't have to take out loans. But I am coming from an institution that has the financial resources to do that. I understand that's not something that all schools are able to do. So just keeping that in mind, and that may not be representative of the whole landscape.
And following up on that, it sounds like we had a question here about communication about the aid process, particularly from your universities. And I was wondering how your schools have communicated information about loans, information about aid, what you're waiting to hear about for next year, either the mechanism that they use to communicate or the ways in which they provide that information. Is it the right ways? Is it easily understandable? How is that information flow working for you?
So Cabrini is a bit slow as far as communicating what you may owe. You have to go check and ask your own questions. And as far as help goes in the financial aid sector, you have to go seek that. But they did send out like monthly notices on what your balance was, that kind of thing. But as far as help, just like giving out there, you gotta look for it, and it's not as easy as you would expect being, on campus. So.
And And I think that with more and more schools having a focus on first-generation low-income students, there has been a call to action among schools to do more. So I think that's very positively helped our institution. Now have 2 highly aided counselors that only work with students that are considered highly aided, which is a majority of you fit into these 2 categories of your family contribution and the amount of aid that you get, and then therefore you qualify and you have dedicated people to help you throughout that process. So that's something that's very beneficial. There's also just a wealth of other resources now available to these students. But outside of that, I would think that because a lot of the students, some of the students are coming from backgrounds where their parents may not be able to speak English, may not be able to understand some of these things. You're going through this process alone, and you can't necessarily rely on familial help to do any of this aid. So kind of working both to not only help students understand the process, but also to educate parents, whether that be translating your website for financial aid to make sure that other parents are able to understand what's happening. But I think that's a huge part that may be lacking in terms of involving familial outreach into the financial aid process.
And we had a question up top just to follow up on some of the broader conversation, which is how much would it take for you not to have to work? If you were going to get a scholarship right now to cover your non-tuition costs, what would it take for you to be able to actually study full time?
I actually don't think I would not work purely because not because of the financial aspects, but for the things that I can say on my resume when I actually apply to jobs in the future. So I think that's an aspect that does need to be taken into consideration, that it's not just necessarily wanting to get enough money to pay for my food, but also that if I work at the law school and I'm pre-law, I can say XYZ, I have experience and kind of work through that. But I mean, in an ideal world, I wouldn't have to work, and then I could do extracurriculars that relate to these things, and then therefore I can put that on something. But you shouldn't do things just for your resume. But that is something that's out there when you come from a lower income background and want to get a job in the future to support your family.
Yeah, I agree most definitely. Even if my school was taken care of, I think I would definitely still work, still go to career and development area to get, like you said, a good resume, because the purpose of going to college was to leave college. So I definitely want to go to, have a nice resume, build a resume while I'm in college. And networking. I can't imagine just going to school and going home. That's not really what I came to college for. I came to make the connections. Now, as far as living at home, I would still have to work anyway. So.
And Eileen, any other impressions about work and its importance in building a career and versus also having to pay for expenses that you heard?
So I just want to say that what we just heard from Desmond and Lewis was also reflected in the first year interviews we did with students. A lot of students, they're not going to stop working either because they get some sort of value out of work. They enjoy what they do. They enjoy their coworkers. And a lot of them, they just, their perspective was like, I'm an adult, I'm going to work. Like, it's not a negotiable thing. I think going back to what I said about students being a very heterogeneous group, right? Like how many students have agency over what type of work they can do, what hours they work, things like that. So I think it's reasonable to expect that students are always going to want to work, but if they can be put in a financial situation where they don't have to in order to avoid financial catastrophe, then maybe they can make choices that better serve their future interests, or that are just more accommodating of their student lives.
A lot less stress and more focus.
Yeah. I work the night shift from 7 to midnight, and that's not necessarily what I would choose if it was a different situation. So things like that, but not necessarily not working.
In my first semester, I had to work from 11 at night to 4 in the morning. So, yeah, it's unfortunate.
And just to tie this a little bit back to the loan conversation. So another quote that just barely didn't make it into the presentation was I was talking to a student who was very reluctant to take out loans and was working probably 35 plus hours a week during the school year. And he was telling me that he had, he was given a Fitbit by his mom for Christmas or something like that. And he was checking how much he was sleeping each night. And he was averaging like 2 hours of sleep a night, like during finals. And that was a situation where, I know there's a lot of anxiety around loans. I know there's a lot of reluctance to take out loans, but, I kind of wish he would take out a small loan and maybe sleep.
Again, we had talked a little bit earlier about some of the supports that go along with some of the Promise programs. I'm wondering if there's any other academic programs that you relied on while you were on campus that were particularly beneficial that you wanted to highlight for folks in the room.
So I entered through Penn CAP, which is our Penn College Achievement Program, and that's where we come in a month early, take classes, get to know the campus, get to know other resources on campus and things like that. And that I credit to a lot of my success at Penn, and I think I would be on a completely different track if I wasn't there for that. And I'm coming back as a peer mentor this coming year to mentor incoming freshmen and sharing and coming full circle kind of thing. And I think that's been a whole wealth of resources and knowledge that I've been able to get. I think the other things that this idea of like diversity versus inclusion, of diversity of having these numbers that you can say and having this wealth of students on campus, but then what is happening on campus in terms of inclusion and how resources are inputted. So if a lot of students are coming from communities of color, do you have the cultural resource centers on campus that are able to support these students when they get to campus? And I think that like Patch, which is the Pan Asian American Community House, has given me a lot of those resources. So I think thinking outside of the box of necessarily just advising and a career services office, but those kind of more cultural and support networks and things like that, that should also be emphasized within programs.
I tried to join, I did join like 4 different clubs my first semester, but I had to make sacrifices, so the clubs were the first to go, unfortunately.
I have 2 more questions. If you were going to make one big recommendation to either a state or federal policymaker about how to design a financial aid program well, what would you focus on? Start there and go down. You can start with Eileen if it looks like Desmond.
Sure. So I would say my recommendation would be that schools, states, whoever is setting sort of the parameters of the program, should be really thoughtful about the academic requirements that they attach to them. And, I definitely understand, and certainly in some, political context, there needs to be a sense that like, oh, this is requiring a certain level of achievement. This is incentivizing a certain level of achievement. But when you put academic requirements on financial aid, essentially you're raising the stakes for students who need that aid. And that's fine. Some students will be really motivated for that, but you need to ensure that you're creating opportunities for students who are going to struggle, either because, they came from high schools where they were underprepared, or, they're working so much that they can't be successful in all of their classes. You need to create opportunities for them to have a meaningful chance of actually achieving those academic standards. So whenever you layer on, academic standards, there needs to be additional supports or additional options for students.
I think there are obviously a lot of things that can be done. This was actually a paper that I wrote for Dr. Perna's class a while back, but in terms of how we structure our on-campus financial aid things that are done through the government, so that being Perkins loans, supplemental education opportunity grants, and other like work study things that are tied to it. The way that it's structured, it's not necessarily bad, but there are institutions that already have been in the program for so long that then get more resources, and that kind of that generational wealth that continues, and then schools that may not have as many resources that don't get as much money from these federal government grants. So like Penn is an institution that, yes, it's great that we get a lot of SEOGs. We probably have the money in our endowment to cover that, and that money could be given to universities that don't necessarily always have that financial resource. So kind of the restructuring of how money is divided and given up to different communities and different schools.
I would say take more in consideration. Even though it may be a hard job and maybe a different way to do this, and this is kind of raw, but research on like areas from which the students are attending from, especially the commuters, because I didn't work on campus for the fact that it was minimum wage. That wasn't going to cut it. So the area that I lived, I worked there and I worked close to my school. So that wasn't, much of a benefactor, but I still got by. And again, there's still much to be paid. So I would say take in consideration of that, and also costs of food on campus, because I looked at like a couple colleges meal plans, or not just meal plans, but the cost if you pay every time you go, ours is definitely higher than our next door neighbors at Eastern. It's ridiculous, like double. Yeah.
My last question for both of you is, what do you want to do when you graduate?
I want to be a professional stockbroker and investor. Yeah, that's the basis of it. Can't give everything away.
And I want to go into public health and education, working in school health, like school infrastructure, school lunch programs, and things like that.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us.